The wind howled like a wild animal, crashing against the flimsy walls of the tent. Bonner, a seasoned human soldier, sat huddled in the corner, trying to keep the cold at bay. The temperature outside had dropped so low that even the thick layers of his military uniform couldn't keep out the biting chill. His breath came out in misty clouds, and he could feel the frost creeping along his skin, chilling him to the bone. The outpost was isolated, perched on a desolate, frozen planet at the edge of known space. Humanity's war against the alien species that inhabited this planet had been brutal, with no clear winner in sight. The soldiers stationed here were tired, worn out by endless battles and the unforgiving weather. The planet's ice storms were some of the most dangerous in the galaxy. Even the toughest soldiers had lost their lives to these storms. Bonner had been on this post for what felt like forever, watching the snowstorm rage outside as his comrades slept or stared blankly into the darkness. They were all exhausted, but they had a job to do. And when you're stuck in a frozen wasteland, the job wasn't easy. The silence in the tent was suffocating, broken only by the crackling of a small fire that he'd managed to light. The fire's weak glow barely warmed the air around him, but it was something. Bonner rubbed his hands together, trying to warm his numb fingers. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the night dragged on, the storm outside grew fiercer. The wind sounded almost alive, howling through the cracked windows of the outpost, shaking the very foundations of the building. The cold gnawed at Bonner's bones, making him feel small and helpless against nature's fury. He knew this was only the beginning. The worst of the storm was still to come. Suddenly, a loud thud broke the silence. Bonner's heart skipped a beat. He jumped to his feet, grabbing his rifle and moving swiftly toward the entrance. His mind raced. Was it an animal? Or maybe something worse, one of the enemy factions scouting the area. The enemy was ruthless, and these storms were a perfect cover for any attack. His hand tightened around the weapon as he opened the door of the tent, the cold wind slamming into him like a punch. Through the blinding snow, he could barely make out a figure stumbling toward him, half frozen and barely conscious. Bonner squinted, trying to focus through the snowstorm. His breath caught in his throat when he saw what it was. An alien woman. She was tall and slim, with glowing, almost translucent skin that shimmered like ice under the light of the small fire in his tent. Her eyes, though, were the most striking, an unnatural shade of silver, almost like mirrors reflecting the storm outside. The sight of her in the snow was surreal. Bonner had encountered many enemies from alien species during his time as a soldier, but he had never seen one so vulnerable. She wasn't like the terrifying monsters he'd fought before. She was weak, struggling just to stay on her feet, her breath shallow and rapid. His instincts screamed at him to act. She was from the enemy species, a deadly race of technologically advanced beings that had waged war against humanity for years. But something inside him hesitated. She was clearly in trouble, and despite the danger she represented, Bonner couldn't just leave her out there to die. His training told him to kill any enemy on sight, but his humanity, the part of him that still held on to some sense of right and wrong, pulled him in another direction. With a grunt, he reached out and grabbed her arm, steadying her before she could collapse. "Hey, are you all right?" he asked, his voice firm but laced with uncertainty. He wasn't sure what kind of answer he expected, but the silence that followed was heavy. The alien girl didn't respond, her silver eyes barely focusing on him. Bonner quickly scanned the area. The storm was getting worse, the wind whipping around them like a living thing. They were in no condition to survive out here, especially not with an injured alien. His mind raced. He couldn't just leave her to die. But what if this was some kind of trap? What if she was trying to lure him out into the storm, where her comrades could finish him off? His gaze shifted from the girl to the raging storm outside. He had no time to waste. The wind was picking up, and the temperature was plummeting even further. Without thinking, he made a decision. "Come on," he muttered under his breath as he helped her inside the tent. The warmth of the fire barely touched them as they entered, but it was enough to stave off the worst of the cold. Bonner shoved the door closed and turned to the girl, who collapsed onto the ground with a soft gasp. Her skin was icy to the touch, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Bonner knelt beside her, trying to ignore the nagging voice in his head warning him that he was making a huge mistake. The alien girl's eyes were half closed, her silver pupils darting around the tent in confusion. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words came out in a whisper, barely audible above the sound of the storm outside. "Please, help me," she murmured, her voice soft and desperate. Bonner froze, his breath catching in his throat. He had expected a trap, an ambush. But this was different. Something about her desperation made him pause. Her eyes, there was something in them that made him want to believe she wasn't a threat. For a moment, all he could do was stare at her, unsure of what to do next. His hand hovered over his blaster, but something deep inside told him that killing her wasn't the right thing to do. She wasn't his enemy anymore. Not out here, in the middle of this frozen hell. "All right," he said, his voice low but steady. "I'll help you." Bonner sat down beside the alien girl, watching her as she lay on the cold ground, her body trembling uncontrollably. The fire flickered dimly, casting strange shadows on the walls of the tent. The storm outside continued to rage, the wind howling like a wild animal. But inside the tent, the only sounds were the soft crackling of the fire and the girl's labored breathing. Bonner's mind was spinning. He had made a decision, one that went against everything he had been taught as a soldier. He had brought an enemy into his tent, given her shelter, and now he was responsible for her survival. The cold, hard training he had received for years had always taught him that kindness and compassion were weaknesses, things that would get him killed in the brutal world of war. And yet here he was, risking his life for a member of the very species that had fought against humanity for so long. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake the doubts that clouded his thoughts. His duty was to protect his people, not to help an enemy. But as he looked at the alien girl, he couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility toward her. There was something about her, something that didn't fit the usual image of the enemy. She wasn't the towering, fearsome warriors he had fought in the past. She was fragile, vulnerable, and scared. It was strange. He didn't understand it. The girl stirred, her silver eyes fluttering open. She looked at him for a moment, her expression confused, as if she couldn't quite comprehend why he had helped her. She didn't say anything at first, but Bonner could see the pain in her eyes. She was clearly injured, though it wasn't immediately obvious where. Her skin was so pale and smooth that any wound would be difficult to spot. "You're safe now," Bonner said, his voice soft, but he wasn't sure if she could understand him. The language barrier between them was a real issue, but he hoped that the tone of his voice would communicate what he couldn't say with words. The girl's gaze shifted toward the fire, and for a brief moment, she seemed to relax. Bonner had seen soldiers in the field after long battles, their faces blank from exhaustion, but there was something different in this girl's expression. She wasn't looking for a fight. She wasn't an enemy to him anymore. After a few moments of silence, the girl weakly lifted her hand, and Bonner hesitated before reaching out to help her. Her touch was cold, almost like ice, and he could feel the fragility of her body as she struggled to sit up. She didn't speak, but the way she looked at him, it was almost as if she was waiting for him to explain why he had helped her, why he hadn't left her to freeze in the storm. Bonner sighed, his hand still resting on her shoulder, unsure of what to say. "I couldn't leave you out there," he finally muttered, more to himself than to her. "Even if you're from the other side, I couldn't let you die in the storm." She tilted her head slightly, her eyes studying him with a curious intensity. Her silver pupils seemed to reflect the firelight, as if they held a secret that he wasn't meant to know. She was so different from the soldiers he had fought against, so different from the cold, calculating machines that had led the AI factions. Bonner had always thought of the enemy as just that, enemy. Faceless, nameless beings who were meant to be destroyed. But now, staring into the eyes of this alien girl, he couldn't help but feel a connection. She wasn't just an enemy. She was a person, just like him. She was scared, alone, and fighting to survive in a world that had turned against her. For a moment, there was a silence between them, and Bonner felt the weight of that silence. The fire crackled softly, but it seemed so distant, as if it wasn't enough to bridge the gap between them. The girl slowly lowered her eyes, her hand trembling slightly as she reached up to touch a wound on her side. Bonner's heart tightened as he saw the blood-stained bandages wrapped around her body. She was in pain, and there was nothing he could do to make it better. The thought crossed his mind again. What if she was playing him? What if this was some sort of trick, a way to get him to lower his guard so she could strike when he least expected it? She was from the enemy species, after all. She had to be dangerous. But then, as he watched her, his mind rejected the idea. There was no malice in her eyes, no hunger for violence. She wasn't looking to hurt him. She was just trying to survive. She spoke then, her voice barely above a whisper. Why? Why did you help me? Her words were broken, almost inaudible, but Bonner caught them. The question hung in the air like a weight, and he found himself struggling to answer. I don't know, Bonner said after a long pause. I couldn't leave you out there. I've seen too many people die. I don't want that for you. The girl's eyes softened, and for a moment, Bonner thought he saw something like gratitude in her gaze. It was fleeting, but it was there. Her body seemed to relax, the tension in her shoulders easing, and she let out a small sigh. It wasn't much, but to Bonner, it felt like a sign that he hadn't made the wrong choice. But even as the girl's body relaxed, Bonner's mind was filled with doubts. He had let his guard down. He had done the one thing soldiers were taught never to do. He had shown compassion to the enemy. And in war, compassion was dangerous. Compassion could cost him everything. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the tent, Bonner and the alien girl sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Bonner couldn't shake the feeling that the moment he had chosen to help her might be the moment that doomed them both. Yet, as the girl's slow, steady breathing filled the space, he realized that perhaps compassion wasn't a weakness after all. Maybe, just maybe, it was what would save them both. The hours dragged on, the fire in the tent flickering weakly as the storm outside continued its fury. The howling wind shook the walls, and the biting cold pressed against the tent, but inside there was a strange stillness. Bonner sat across from the alien girl, watching her closely as she rested. She had fallen into a fitful sleep, her body shivering uncontrollably, despite the warmth from the fire. Bonner couldn't stop his mind from racing. The decision to help her, to bring her into the safety of the tent, had felt right at the time. But now, with her lying in front of him, helpless and vulnerable, doubts crept in. He was stuck. There was no going back. He had let her into his world, and now he was responsible for her. But what did that even mean? He wasn't sure if he could fully trust her. She was from the enemy's side, part of the alien faction that had caused so much destruction and death. The fact that she was now lying in front of him, in need of help, was something that Bonner didn't fully understand. He had been trained to see aliens like her as nothing more than enemies. They were cold, calculating, and ruthless. They attacked without mercy, using their superior technology to overwhelm human forces at every turn. And yet here she was, looking like nothing more than a scared, helpless woman. She wasn't the enemy soldier he had fought against. She was someone different, and it unsettled him. The girl stirred in her sleep, her silver eyes flickering open for a moment. She looked at him with a faint expression, but there was no hostility in her gaze. She wasn't plotting anything, and she wasn't reaching for a weapon. She was just there, a broken, vulnerable being, caught in the same storm that threatened to destroy them both. For a brief moment, Bonner felt a strange connection to her, a sense of shared struggle. They were both trapped in this nightmare, helpless to escape. He couldn't help but wonder, could she be trusted? Was this some sort of trick, a way for the enemy to gain an advantage? Had she played him by feigning weakness? The thought made his skin crawl. It was possible. It was always possible. But there was a part of him, the human part, that told him to give her a chance. To not judge her just because of what she was. He sighed and rubbed his face, trying to push the doubts away. The storm outside was relentless, and if they didn't figure out how to survive together, neither of them would make it through the night. Bonner knew that much. He had been in plenty of life or death situations before, but this one was different. The enemy was supposed to be his adversary, someone he had to fight, not someone he was forced to trust. But here he was, stuck with an alien who could potentially betray him at any moment. The line between enemy and ally was blurring, and it left him feeling more uncertain than he had ever felt before. The girl seemed to sense his unease. She looked at him again, her eyes softening as if she could feel the tension in the air. For a moment, they both just stared at each other. Bonner was at a loss for words. What could he say? What was there to say? He had let an enemy soldier into his tent. He had chosen to help her. And now he was left to figure out how to survive alongside her, unsure of what to do next. Suddenly, the girl spoke, her voice raspy and weak. I don't understand. Bonner's gaze snapped to her, his heart skipping a beat. She was awake now, her eyes locked on him, and there was a strange vulnerability in her voice. What don't you understand? He asked, his tone guarded but curious. Why? Why would you help me? She whispered. I am your enemy. Bonner stared at her, his mind racing. She was right. She was the enemy, yet here she was, asking him why he had chosen to help her. The question wasn't one he had an easy answer for. In his training, he had been taught to never show mercy, to never hesitate when facing an enemy. Compassion was a weakness that could get him killed, but this wasn't like any fight he had ever been in before. It wasn't about strategy or combat. It was about survival. It was about making a choice, even when the choice didn't make sense. I don't know, Bonner admitted, his voice quieter than he intended. I don't know why I did it. I couldn't leave you out there. The girl looked at him for a long time, her silver eyes searching his face as if trying to figure him out. For a moment, it felt like they were locked in some sort of silent battle, each trying to understand the other, both unsure of the outcome. Finally, she spoke again, her voice softer this time. I don't want to fight anymore, she said, her words surprising him. Her voice was weak, but there was a sincerity in it that Bonner couldn't ignore. I never wanted this war, but I was forced to fight, just like you. Bonner blinked, unsure of how to respond. He had always seen the enemy as faceless monsters, people who fought for their own reasons, but were still the enemy. But now, listening to her, he realized something that shook him to his core. They weren't all that different. She wasn't just a soldier. She was someone like him. Someone caught in a war they never chose. The realization made Bonner's chest tighten. He had always believed that the enemy was evil, that they deserved to be fought against with everything humanity had. But now, faced with the consequences of that belief, he wasn't so sure anymore. What if they were all just pawns in a much larger game, one that neither side truly understood? For the first time, he realized the weight of what he had done. He had trusted her. He had brought her into his life, not as an enemy, but as someone in need of help. And that trust came with a risk that could cost him his life. But it was a risk he was willing to take, because sometimes, in the chaos of war, the most dangerous thing to do wasn't to fight. It was to trust. The storm outside had not relented. The fierce winds howled relentlessly, rattling the tent with a deafening roar. But inside, the warmth of the fire and the heavy silence between Bonner and the alien girl were a world apart. He sat cross-legged, watching the girl, who had barely moved since the last time she spoke. Her silver eyes glinted in the firelight, the deep exhaustion in her expression matching the fatigue he felt deep in his bones. Bonner couldn't deny the unease creeping through his chest. He had allowed himself to trust her, or at least to help her. But every moment they shared together in the small, cramped tent seemed to deepen the conflict inside him. She was the enemy. Her people had fought against humanity for years. Her presence in his world was a reminder of all that had been lost in the war. His comrades, his friends, all the sacrifices. And yet, here she was, fragile and vulnerable, needing him in a way no enemy soldier ever had. The irony of it all wasn't lost on him. The girl shifted slightly, breaking Bonner from his thoughts. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders tighter, her silver hair flowing like liquid metal, and glanced up at him. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, as if silently measuring the distance between them. Bonner couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so conflicted. He had always known where he stood, what his mission was. Now, everything felt like it was in flux. "You don't have to stay here," the girl said, her voice soft but clear, breaking the silence. She spoke in a hesitant tone, as though she wasn't sure how her words would be received. Bonner raised an eyebrow, confused. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice rough from hours of talking. "I mean, you've helped me enough. You're risking your life just by being near me. I understand why you'd want to leave. You don't have to protect me." Her words were calm, but there was an underlying sadness in her voice. It was clear that, in her world, weakness was not something to be shown. Yet here, in this moment of vulnerability, she had shown more emotion than he had ever seen in an enemy soldier. It caught him off guard. Bonner leaned forward slightly, studying her closely. He noticed how she pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around herself as though she were trying to make herself smaller. "It's not about that," he said quietly. "It's about survival. You don't need to be alone out there, not in that storm. It's not just about you being my enemy or not. I won't leave you to die." For a long moment, the girl didn't say anything. She simply looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. Bonner felt a pang in his chest at the sight. She wasn't like the cold, calculating soldiers he had fought against. She wasn't a warrior driven by the need to conquer. She was a person who was caught in the same deadly game, just on the other side. Finally, the girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions that Bonner couldn't quite place. Her gaze softened, and there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something he could almost swear was gratitude. It wasn't something he had expected from her. "Why are you so kind to me?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Bonner felt the weight of the question settle heavily on him. He had never seen kindness as something to offer to the enemy. In the past, he had been taught to fight, to kill, and to not question his orders. But this girl, she was different. He didn't know what it was, but something about her made him reconsider everything he had ever believed about his role in the war. "I don't know," Bonner said quietly, shaking his head. "Maybe because I don't believe you're the enemy anymore. I've fought plenty of battles, seen plenty of people die. But all that fighting, it doesn't feel like it's getting anyone anywhere. I'm tired of the killing. I'm tired of the bloodshed." Her eyes widened slightly, her expression softening even more. She was listening, really listening, as if his words were opening a door she never expected to find. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke again, but there was something in it that made Bonner stop in his tracks. "I never wanted to be part of this war," she said, her voice fragile. "I never wanted to hurt anyone, but when the war came to my planet, I had no choice but to fight. I didn't choose to be part of this conflict. I just want to survive. Just like you." Bonner blinked, his chest tightening as he processed her words. This wasn't what he had expected. He had always seen the enemy as faceless invaders, people who destroyed and conquered without remorse. He had never considered that they, too, might have been forced into this fight. But the girl's words echoed in his mind, and he realized something that he had been too blind to see before. She wasn't a monster. She was a victim of the same war that had torn apart his world. And somehow, against all odds, they were both trapped in this nightmare together. For a moment, the only sound in the tent was the storm outside, its fierce winds howling as though they, too, were caught in the same struggle. The fire crackled in the background, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Bonner's thoughts were a swirl of confusion, his heart torn between the soldier he had been trained to be and the man who had come to see the girl not as an enemy, but as someone caught in the same cycle of violence and pain. The girl slowly reached up, touching the wound on her side again. Bonner's gaze lingered on her hand for a moment, and without thinking, he reached for the medical supplies he had kept by his side. "You need to let me help you," he said softly. For the first time since she had entered his life, the girl didn't protest. Instead, she nodded, allowing him to tend to her injuries. Bonner could see the pain in her eyes, but there was something else there now. It wasn't just pain, it was trust. A trust that he hadn't earned yet, but one that she was willing to offer despite everything. And in that moment, he knew something had changed between them. As Bonner carefully cleaned her wounds and bandaged her up, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Was this the start of something new? Or was it just a fleeting moment of humanity in a world torn apart by war? Whatever the answer was, he knew one thing for sure. They had found something in each other that neither had expected: a bond, a connection, an understanding that in the middle of all the chaos, there could still be moments of compassion, and that moment of compassion was something neither of them could ignore. The storm outside had not relented. The wind had picked up even more, howling like a wild beast, rattling the tent with fierce gusts. Bonner could feel the cold creeping into the edges of the canvas as he huddled next to the fire. The warmth from the flames was slowly fading, and he knew that if they didn't do something soon, they wouldn't survive the night. His eyes flickered to the alien girl lying nearby, wrapped in the thin blanket. Her breathing was shallow, her body still weak from the exposure and the wound she had sustained. He had done what he could for her injuries, but she needed rest, and more than that, she needed warmth. Bonner's thoughts were interrupted by the sharp crack of thunder outside, followed by an eerie silence. The wind stopped, and the sound of distant explosions echoed through the air. Something was wrong. The storm was masking something bigger, a presence, a force coming closer. Bonner instinctively stood up, moving to the entrance of the tent. His hand reached for his rifle, fingers tightening around the cold metal. The alien girl stirred, her silver eyes snapping open as if she sensed the same danger. She pulled herself into a sitting position, her body trembling, though not from the cold anymore. Something else was approaching. Bonner looked at her, his heart pounding. He had already taken one massive risk by helping her, but now, the situation had escalated. The storm outside had made it nearly impossible to detect anything until it was too late. He scanned the horizon, his trained soldier's instincts kicking in. His mind raced, piecing together the facts. This was no coincidence. The enemy had probably followed the same storm that had driven them to seek shelter here. The girl's voice broke through the tension, shaky but determined. "You should leave. It's dangerous." Bonner shot her a quick look. "Dangerous for both of us," he said sharply. "We don't have time to argue. We need to be ready." Her expression shifted from fear to resignation. "I know how to fight. I may not be strong right now, but I can help you." Bonner didn't have time to question her offer. There was no denying that they were both at risk now, and if they didn't act fast, they wouldn't get out of this alive. He reached for his gear, quickly securing his rifle and checking the ammunition. The girl's voice, though still weak, had an edge of determination that Bonner couldn't ignore. The storm outside seemed to intensify, the sound of cracking trees and thunder shaking the earth beneath them. It was then that Bonner heard it, the low hum of an engine, the unmistakable sound of an enemy craft hovering overhead. They were here. The aliens had found them. The girl's face paled, and Bonner saw her grab the side of the tent for support. She was still injured, but she was determined to fight. Bonner quickly moved to her side, ready to help her if needed. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice steady. The girl nodded, her silver eyes hardening with resolve. "I won't let you fight alone," she whispered, and Bonner realized that, in her own way, she had made a promise. The tent shuddered as the enemy craft hovered just outside their makeshift shelter. Bonner's heart was pounding, his mind racing. He had never been one to back down, but the stakes were different now. His enemy had changed. The girl was no longer just a soldier. She was someone who was fighting for her life, just like he was. Suddenly, the tent's opening was ripped apart by a burst of gunfire. Bonner dove for cover, pulling the girl with him as the walls of the tent collapsed inwards. The air was filled with the sound of gunfire, and the bright flashes illuminated the dark night. Bonner's instincts kicked in, and he fired back, his shots cutting through the chaos. The girl was already moving, despite her injuries, taking cover behind a pile of crates as she aimed her weapon at the advancing enemy forces. The enemy was relentless, their soldiers storming in with weapons raised, their cold, robotic faces showing no sign of hesitation. Bonner could see their superior technology, their advanced weapons, and their armor that seemed nearly impervious to anything he had in his arsenal. But he wasn't about to give up. He couldn't. He glanced at the girl, who was now firing back with deadly accuracy, her movements smooth despite her obvious weakness. The gunfire from her side was rhythmic and controlled, as though she had done this hundreds of times before. Bonner's respect for her grew in that moment. Despite everything, she was fighting, not just for her own survival, but for both of them. But the enemy was closing in fast, and they were outnumbered. Bonner quickly realized that they couldn't keep up this fight for long. They needed a plan, something to turn the tide. "Over here," Bonner shouted to the girl. "We need to fall back to the ridge. We'll have a better vantage point." The girl glanced at him, her expression unreadable. Without hesitation, she nodded, signaling that she understood. The two of them sprinted toward the rear of the wreckage, using the scattered debris as cover as the enemy advanced. Bonner's heart was pounding in his chest, and every step felt like it was bringing them closer to death. But he couldn't afford to let fear take over. They had to survive. They had to keep moving. As they neared the ridge, Bonner glanced behind them. The enemy soldiers were close, but the ridge offered higher ground and a better position to fight back. They had a moment's advantage, and they couldn't waste it. The girl was still beside him, her breath coming in shallow gasps, but her determination had not faltered. She fired back at the advancing forces with a steady hand, providing cover as Bonner continued to lead them up the slope. When they finally reached the top, Bonner immediately took cover behind a large rock, pulling the girl down beside him. The enemy was still coming, but they had a moment to breathe. Bonner knew this was their chance. "We make our stand here," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We fight, and we fight to survive. Do you understand?" The girl nodded, her face set in determination. "I understand," she said, her voice filled with resolve. The battle was far from over. But for the first time since the storm had started, Bonner felt a flicker of hope. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for each other. And in that moment, that made all the difference. The sounds of battle echoed around them, the clash of weapons, the heavy thud of boots hitting the ground, and the occasional explosion shaking the air. Bonner crouched behind a large rock, his heart hammering in his chest as he reloaded his rifle. He could feel the cold sweat on his forehead, mixing with the dirt and grime of the battle. His hand shook, but he forced himself to focus. He couldn't afford to let his fear show. Not now. Not when the girl was counting on him. She was beside him, her silver eyes scanning the enemy forces with sharp precision. Despite the wounds she had suffered and the exhaustion in her body, she moved with grace, her actions as quick and deadly as any soldier Bonner had ever seen. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a warrior. Bonner's mind raced as he calculated their next move. They had managed to reach the ridge, gaining higher ground, but the enemy wasn't far behind. Their technology was far superior to anything Bonner's team had ever faced. He could see their advanced armor and weapons glinting in the dim light. It was only a matter of time before they broke through their defenses. But there was something else, something that Bonner couldn't ignore. The girl. She wasn't just a casualty or a burden. She had become a partner in this fight. They had fought side by side, and in that brief moment of shared danger, a bond had been formed. He wasn't fighting just for survival anymore. He was fighting to protect her. The thought struck him like a jolt of electricity. He couldn't let her down. "We need to get out of here," Bonner said in a low voice, his eyes scanning the horizon for an escape route. The girl, her face set with determination, nodded. "I know. I can feel it too. They're closing in." Bonner hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do next. The terrain around them was treacherous, and if they tried to move now, they would be exposed. But staying put meant death. There was no winning this fight unless they did something drastic. "I have an idea," the girl said, her voice steady but urgent. She leaned closer to Bonner, her breath coming out in shallow gasps. "But it's risky." Bonner looked at her, his brow furrowing. "What is it?" She pointed to a distant ridge, barely visible in the fading light. "That's where their main command center is. If we can disrupt their communications, it'll buy us time. The enemy will be forced to regroup, giving us a chance to escape." Bonner's eyes narrowed as he considered the plan. It was dangerous, but it was their best shot. If they didn't act now, they would be overwhelmed. And Bonner wasn't ready to die. Not like this. "You're right," he said, his voice steady with resolve. "We'll make our way there." The girl nodded, her silver eyes flashing with determination. "We do this together. We fight as one." Bonner met her gaze, his heart swelling with something he couldn't explain. They had been strangers just days ago, yet now they were partners in this fight for survival. And in this moment, it didn't matter that they were from different worlds. They were united in their fight. The two of them moved quickly, using the rocks and debris as cover. Bonner's military training kicked in as he led the way, staying low to the ground and keeping his senses sharp. The girl was right behind him, moving with quiet precision. He could feel her presence like a force of nature, her determination driving them both forward. They didn't speak much as they moved, their every step calculated and deliberate. The sounds of the enemy soldiers searching for them grew louder, but they pressed on, their goal clear. The ridge was their destination, and if they could reach it, they might just have a chance. As they neared the enemy command center, Bonner could see the complex from a distance. It was heavily guarded, with drones patrolling the perimeter and armed soldiers stationed at every corner. The security was tight, but Bonner wasn't about to let that stop him. "We need to create a distraction," Bonner said, his voice barely a whisper. "Something to pull them away from the command center." The girl nodded, already thinking ahead. "I can set an explosion near the east wall. It'll draw their attention, and you can slip in while they're distracted." Bonner's heart skipped a beat. "Are you sure you can handle it?" She gave him a sly smile. "I've handled worse." Without another word, she disappeared into the shadows, moving with the stealth and grace of a predator. Bonner watched her go, his pulse quickening with anticipation. This was their chance. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever as Bonner waited, his breath steady, every muscle in his body tense. He could hear the sounds of the enemy moving closer, and his grip tightened on his rifle. He had to trust the girl. She had proven herself time and time again, and now it was his turn to put his faith in her. Then, the explosion came. The blast shook the ground beneath him, sending a plume of smoke and debris into the air. The soldiers guarding the complex immediately shifted their attention, rushing toward the source of the explosion. Bonner didn't waste a second. He sprinted toward the command center, staying low to the ground, his heart racing in his chest. He reached the entrance of the facility, ducking behind a large metal structure to catch his breath. The enemy was disoriented, and Bonner took full advantage of the chaos. He slipped inside, his rifle raised, eyes scanning the dark interior. The facility was eerily quiet, and Bonner knew he had to move quickly. But then, something unexpected happened. From the shadows, the girl appeared, her silver eyes gleaming with triumph. She had done it. She had created the perfect distraction. Bonner couldn't help but smile. "You did it." She nodded, her face flushed with excitement. "Now we finish this." Together, they moved deeper into the command center, determined to disrupt the enemy's operations once and for all. They knew they were playing with fire, but this was their only shot. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about winning. And for the first time in a long while, Bonner felt a spark of hope. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for.